Welcome to the Writer's Journey podcast. I'm Michael Laron, a science fiction and fantasy author on a journey to go from nobody to bestseller, and I'm documenting every step of the way. Tune in every week as I pull back the curtain on my writing life and how I'm building a writing career while working a full-time job, raising a family, and attending law school classes in the evenings. You can find show notes for this week's episode, a free starter library of my fiction, and much more at michaellaron.com. Hello and welcome to episode 88. So the title of this week's episode is Lighthouses and Amusement Parks. And you're probably wondering, what the heck does that mean, Michael? Well, I have not been to a lighthouse and I have not been to an amusement park since our last episode. So, should be interesting. So, quick updates on how things are going with me. I had alluded last week or the last 2 weeks that I was waiting anxiously and desperately to get my midterm back for my law class, and I did get it back. I actually got it back last week, but it was after this show went live, and I'm pleased to report that I got a 100% on my midterm. More specifically, I actually got like a 125% because I got some extra credit things, but who's counting? So this is that midterm that I wrote while I was on the porch on Halloween giving out candy to kids. So I wrote this into the dark, and I spotted some issues. She gave like a test case or like a fact pattern of this person at work and some things that happened to her, and what legal issues would you file a lawsuit on? And so found all the different issues, and she even gave me extra credit because one of my arguments was so creative that she thought that it would be very effective. So that is a great thing. Very, very, I don't want to say validating because I knew I could do it, but it's just great to hear a professor give you good feedback like that, especially someone who's been practicing law as long as she has. So that was very encouraging, and just a testament that, who would think that fiction writing skills would be transferable to other areas of your life, right? So writing into the dark is a transferable skill now, officially. So I also had talked a couple weeks ago about how I got an invitation to go to San Jose, California, to teach another class for this insurance thing that I'm doing. And I did accept that invitation. So in September of 2020, I will be going to San Jose, sunny San Jose. And my wife and I have decided to go ahead and make a family vacation out of it. So that should be pretty fun. I've never been to San Jose, so that'll be cool. And I think we're going to try to take a side trip down to Monterey because we have a friend who lives in Monterey and haven't seen her in a long time. So that should be kind of cool. I knew that was like one of those 24-hour decisions that you have to make. So yeah, that's kind of interesting. And then this club. So last week I told you I was going to be teaching an insurance class last week, and I finished the class, and it went very well. It went just as well as the class that I taught back in September, and yeah, I really have no complaints. There was only one snafu. There's a test at the end that the students have to take, and the nonprofit organization sent me the wrong test. So that was a little bit of a fiasco, but with some quick thinking, I was able to salvage the situation, and it ended very well. And so the students can rate the faculty member or the instructor on a scale out of 10. And on a scale of 10, I got, so far, I think about 5 or 6 10 out of 10s, which I think that's pretty cool. That's, like feather in my cap, not to like brag or anything, but definitely an indicator that the things that I've been doing and the public speaking practice and things that I've been doing with this podcast and writing tip of the day is definitely translating when I am doing public speaking in person. It's definitely translating very loud and clear. And so it just goes to show that this is something that took 2 or 3 years to actually like get into fruition. But now that it's starting to pay off, I think that there are some good things that are going to come out of it. So yeah, so I taught this class, and I actually had to drive home in a snowstorm, which wasn't really a whole lot of fun. But while I was driving home in this snowstorm, long drives is about a 2.5-hour drive for me. And I've always found that long drives are a great time to sit back and reflect. Now, I don't like to drive without anything on because, the highway hypnosis thing, I think that's real and I don't want to fall asleep. And it was like 7 o'clock at night and it was super dark. And, so I needed something to entertain myself. And so I was listening to a podcast it was a podcast by a therapist. And it was actually the same podcast the same website that I had mentioned last week. It was called liminalspace.com, and they have a podcast, and it's called Life Through Transitions. And I was listening to a couple of the interviews, and the cool thing about this show is that they actually interview people who have been through either near-death experiences or major experiences in their lives that force them to grow and evolve and self-reflect and become a better person than who they were. And there was one gentleman on the show who I absolutely loved his interview. It was a gentleman by the name of Michael O'Brien. And I'll drop a link to his website and his book in the podcast. It was just a really great interview. Basically, he was this corporate guy, was like a corporate executive, and had to fly somewhere. I think it was like New Mexico for like a week, and was sitting through PowerPoint presentations and just kind of hating his life and wondering what was going on. So he decided to go for a bike ride one day, and as he came around one of the corners, a Ford Explorer basically hit him head on, and he hit the windshield, flew to the ground, and basically had a life-threatening injury, and all of his agency just disappeared overnight, right? And he couldn't even go to the bathroom without getting either a nurse or his wife to help him, and he was the primary breadwinner in the house, and he had to deal with that, like feeling like a burden. And you talk about a liminal space. So I talked about liminal spaces last week, and huge thank you to those of you who reached out to me and said that episode resonated with you. I really appreciated that. And, as I think about things to talk about for this show, that's just always helpful for me. So it's a heartfelt thank you for those of you who reached out and said that it resonated with you. And so as Michael was talking about his liminal space and some of the things that he had to do in order to change his perspective, one of the things that he said that I really liked was that he decided, I think it was in 1999 or 1994, he decided that on that day, even though he was still dealing with a lot of chronic pain, he was in recovery, literally could have died and was extremely lucky, he decided that day was going to be his last bad day. And ever since, he's been doing corporate leadership coaching, executive coaching, and life training. And one of the things he talked about was this concept of a Peloton. And I'm not talking about the bike that's advertised a lot on television. But that name comes from another name in bicycling, where if you look at the Tour de France or you look at a lot of cyclists that are going down a road, they form what's called a peloton. And essentially, the peloton is almost like I always like to describe it as like a human school of fish, right? It's this group of people all riding together, and they can't really talk to each other because they're going really fast, but they're communicating in this really special way. So they're moving around potholes, and they're going around corners, and they're literally inches away from each other. And there's this trust that they have to have in each other to know that, okay, the person in front of me is not going to slam on their brakes and I'm not going to crash into them and we're both not going to die. And so there's this trust. And so one of the things he talked about was, how do you build your personal peloton around you? Who are the people on your personal board of directors per se, right? And so I just thought that was a great concept. And as he was talking about the different things that he had dealt with in his life, so many dots were connecting with me in terms of the therapy that I said that I started last week. So if you didn't listen to last week's episode, I'd mentioned that I had started therapy. And the reason I started it was to try to reconcile some of these odd feelings that I've been feeling over the last year or so about my dad, and how my dad essentially abandoned me and didn't want anything to do with me, and his family abandoned me and didn't want anything to do with me, even though they lived literally blocks away from where I grew up. And I didn't know this until very much later in life. And so I've always struggled with that. And so I've been talking to the therapist, and one of the things that she's been asking every time I go is, well, what do you want to talk about? And well, how are you feeling? Is the first question she asks. And then, is there anything you wanted to make sure that we talk about today? And so I've just been on the lookout for things to talk about so that I can come to her with, some things that are going to generate some substantive conversation. And so as I was listening to this podcast interview, and as it was super dark outside, and as the snow was literally almost blinding me driving through the road, I started thinking about a conversation that I had with my wife that when I had my first therapy session. And she had asked, well, a lot of people don't know what their life's purpose is. And so she asked, do you know what your life's purpose is? And, my answer, I wasn't able to answer that. And you would think that someone like me, who is fairly ambitious and fairly productive and who is driven, would have an answer to that question. And I didn't. And I had been thinking about it and thinking about it. Some people, it seems to me that people have life purposes that fall into two different categories. One is that really big life purpose, right? So I could say that I am meant to write books that are going to change the course of history. I'm just giving a silly example, but or some people say I'm the second coming of Jesus Christ. I don't believe that. That's pretty bold, right? Because you can say that that's your life's purpose. But at the end of the day, if you fall short of that purpose, then you're going to feel like a failure. You're going to feel like you didn't realize your whole potential. And then on the other side of that, there's the smaller purposes, right? Like I meant to start a nonprofit organization in my city to help people in my city, right, get better. Like that's another silly example. Not really silly, but it's an example on a smaller scale of the different types of purposes that people can say that they have in their lives, right? But I think at the end of the day, even if you feel like you are really inspired, even if you feel like God spoke to you and said, I need you to go here or do this, I still think that at the end of the day, your life purpose is really just an opinion. It's your opinion of what you think you are here to do. And so as a writer, I can say I think that my life's purpose is to create books that are going to change people's lives, or to help 1 million people around the world write a book, right? Take them from dreaming, aspiring writer to published writer. I can say that. I can say that, and I can believe that. But at the end of the day, that's just an opinion. The only thing I know for sure, and I wonder if other writers have ever thought about this, but the one thing I know for sure is that I was called to be a writer. I know that. I know that I was called to be a writer, and I know that I have been called to use the gifts that I have: public speaking, communication, being good with people, being able to think long term. Some of the gifts that I have. I know that I've been called to use those to help people's lives, right? And I know that I know that for a fact, but I don't know that that's necessarily my life's purpose, right? So it's unlikely that I'll be a Steve Jobs-like person, right? And Steve Jobs used to famously say, how can I dent the universe? I'm not going to dent the universe. That's not... Yeah, would it be nice? But that's not on my bucket list of things to do. And I don't know that writers in general wake up in the morning and say, I want to dent the universe. That's not what we're thinking on a daily basis. We're thinking about books, and we're thinking about characters, right? And I believe that you don't have to be a Steve Jobs-like person in order to have value in the world, in order to have worth, in order to make the world a better place. I think, honestly, that anyone can make the world a better place. There's this concept of leading from any seat, right? That everybody always looks to the CEO to be the one in a company or corporation that makes the substantive change. But at the end of the day, anyone, even the person in the mailroom, can actually make a difference in the life of a company, just like anyone, even the homeless guy on the street, can make a lasting contribution and a difference in the life of the community. And so I don't know that your life purpose needs to be that significant in order to truly matter. And so I know I'm getting deep on you, but I thought back in my life to books because that is my primary calling. And I thought about in my life all of the books that I read that made a difference in my life, or that made me see the world a different way, or that made me feel just wonderful as I was reading them. And I thought about the writers that wrote those books, like Ray Bradbury, for example, someone who had just an endlessly positive impact on how I see the world and how I view the art and craft of writing. And I thought about them, and it's true that some books did change my perspective, and some writers definitely changed my perspective, but no single book or no single writer actually ever changed my life. Like, I've never in my life have picked up a book, read that book from cover to cover, and then said, my life is going to be different. That has never happened to me. Now, I've read books where I've been impacted and I said, I want to go do that. I want to go do something, and I'm inspired, but I never picked up a book and said, my life will never be the same after I read this. And so I thought about nonfiction. There's never been a single book or a blog post or a podcast that's changed my life in any significant way. Now, I'm not saying that to say that it's never changed my perspective. I'm just saying there's never been a single one of those things that has transformed the very fabric of who I am. But many of those things, books, podcasts, blogs, they did inspire me or empower me to take some sort of action. And it's almost like a micro action, if you will, right? So I read a blog post once on how to start a blog, and I thought it was helpful. So I went off and I followed the steps in that blog. I listened to a podcast like by Michael O'Brien, and I was so inspired by his story that I went off and I bought a book, and that book helped me see myself differently, but it didn't change my life. And if I think about all of those different actions that those things inspired me to take, none of those single actions, like I said, was transformative. But if you add all of those micro actions up, the sum of the parts, I think, are far greater than the individual parts. And books and knowledge, I think, form this very interesting web, or a mosaic, if you will, that is very strong. And I think every person's web or mosaic is going to look completely different if you were to peel away the person and peel away their soul and look at exactly the blueprint of their soul. I think every book and every blog post and every thing that they've read or watched or played, I think, had an impact on them in some way, but they were in a very micro way, right? And so it got me thinking, perhaps the life purpose of a writer is not to make dents in people's lives or even the universe. Maybe the purpose of a writer is to use their gifts to send their books blindly out into the world with the goal of helping people take micro actions in their lives that will lead them or put them on the path to future greatness. I think that when you publish your book, you really do send it out blindly. And when you do publish your book, that book enters this stream of consciousness, the stream of consciousness of the world, of humanity, right? And it enters it along with every other book, every other piece of art ever created. And not everyone in the world is going to see it. Not everyone in the world that sees your book is going to be moved by it. Some people are going to be repulsed by it. But there's a small percentage of people who your book is going to touch. And maybe that's what you should be thinking about. And I'm not saying that as a prescriptive for you listening. I'm just saying, as for myself, maybe that's what I should be thinking about. And I think that execution matters, right? We talk about execution, and you've got to create a good book. You've got to tell a good story. You've got to put together good packaging and good covers, and understand copywriting and understand sales and understand what makes your readers tick. But I also think that intent matters just as much as execution. Why are you creating this book? The whole thing of, well, what's your why? And so that got me thinking about nonfiction versus fiction. And while I was driving home in this snowstorm and it was hard to see, I remembered that famous quote about driving in the dark and headlights. I forget who it was that said it, but writing is like driving in the dark with your headlights. You can't see the whole way, but if you just keep going, you'll make the drive. It's something like that. I guarantee most of you listening to this know what I'm talking about. It's a famous quote. And so I was listening to this podcast that moved me, but so much of it spoke to me, but it didn't change my life per se. And so I started thinking about what my role is. Why do I create nonfiction? Why am I behind a microphone doing this episode of The Writer's Journey? Why do I put myself on camera for Author Level Up? Why do I write fiction? Why do I even do the things that I'm doing, right? Why? Because if I don't know what my life's purpose is, why am I doing all of these things? And for nonfiction, I realized that maybe my role is to be a lighthouse, right? And if you think about what a lighthouse does, a lighthouse shines a light on the rocks so that other ships don't see the rocks. So it helps other ships avoid the rocks. Maybe my role is to shine a light on the rocks of the writing life so that other writers behind me can avoid those rocks. Now, I don't say that arrogantly, but I just say it in a way that, I want to help other people succeed. I have an unconditional love for writers and writing because of what it has done in my life. And so I want to help other people get to where I am, right? But, I thought about this metaphorically, conceptually, right? I'm a lighthouse. It's kind of weird. But if it was true that I was a lighthouse, that's kind of boring, right? I mean, you're going to be like a lighthouse. You're not going to be able to go anywhere. So I was like, well, I'm not really a fixed structure. Like, that's not my only thing, right? It's not just helping writers. I also am a writer myself. Like, I'm very much on a journey myself. And so I imagine, metaphorically here, I imagine myself in an ocean voyage, and I imagine myself on a ship, and I imagine myself throwing out these seeds to the shore as I'm on the ocean passing by. And I imagined those seeds becoming lighthouses, the seeds growing into lighthouses, and those lighthouses being able to shine a light on everything that was behind me, so that all of the ships behind me can see what I couldn't see in the beginning. And maybe they would be glad for it. Now, I know that that's a weird analogy, but that's kind of how I saw my role with nonfiction is, can I be some sort of lighthouse to the people that have the ears to hear what it is that I'm saying, right? So, that analogy didn't quite work for fiction, though, because, I'm writing fiction, and the goal of fiction is to entertain people. It's not to show them any kind of rocks. So, maybe I had the thought, maybe as a fiction writer, I'm planting amusement parks on the shore. If you think about it, an amusement park is this weird kind of liminal space, right? You're not there very long, but there is something oddly healing about amusement parks. They're places of laughter, places of fun, places of memories. People fall in love at amusement parks. People go to dates on amusement parks. And it's just an interesting thought, right? So the idea of creating an amusement park is, am I creating a place where readers can come and have fun, and they can leave feeling better than what they felt when they walked in, right? And so that's where the idea of this episode title came from. Lighthouses and amusement parks. So I've been starting to ask myself, with the content that I'm creating, with my nonfiction content, like this podcast episode, for example, is every piece of content that I create a lighthouse? Does it shine some sort of light? Now, a lighthouse isn't going to help you see everything, but it is going to help you avoid the things that are going to destroy you, right? Is the content that I'm creating a lighthouse? Is every YouTube video I'm creating shining some sort of light and helping at least one person see some kind of rock, right? And then with fiction, is what I'm creating an amusement park? Is this a place where people can come and have fun, leave their troubles at the door, and leave feeling a little bit lighter? And so then you have to ask yourself the question, well, what does lighthouse content look like? What does amusement park content look like? I don't know the answer to that. I really don't. But, you think about these things, and you think of, and this all ties back to life purpose, right? And you think about life purpose. Maybe that's my purpose. Maybe it's not. I don't necessarily know that there's anything wrong with not knowing what your purpose in life is, especially if you are a writer. I think writers are smack dab in the middle of a scale, right? There are some people who want to have huge impacts in the world, and then there are some people who don't really want to have major impacts. They just want to touch people who are close to them. I think writers are in the middle. I think writers want to have an impact on a broader scale, and I think they but at the same time, I don't know that they necessarily, want to not create something that doesn't have an impact at all, right? And so I feel like I'm kind of right in the middle, and I'm strangely okay with where I am. Some people might feel, well, if I don't know my life purpose, then I've got to go and I've got to search until I find it. And I don't think that that's true. I think that if you feel that you are called to be a writer, embrace the fact that you're a writer, because I think, and this is what makes writing so unique, is that you're never going to know what kind of impact your writing has on someone's life, right? You can sell 10 books today, right? And out of those 10 books, you might impact one person or you might impact 0 people, right? When those people read your book and they, whether it be fiction or nonfiction, and they get to the end of it, they may be moved, they may not be moved. And if they are moved, you might be lucky if they call you out on Twitter, or if they join your mailing list, or if they write you a very nice letter to let you know how your content affected them. But most of the time, you're not going to know. And you're creating content blindly. And if you want to take this in a religious way, you are creating content in faith. In faith that it's going to work out for you or someone else in the future. And you just have to simply trust that even though you don't know what that's going to be, you just simply have to trust that what you're doing has value and that what you're doing has worth, and that what you're doing will eventually come back to you in the form of either money or in the form of support. But you're flying blind, right? And so that's why I said last week that writing is very much like a liminal space. It's like a permanent liminal space, and you're creating liminal spaces, right? Because that's what books are. Someone reads a book, they're not going to read it forever. They're eventually going to read it. It's going to impact them in some way, and then they're going to put it down. And so if we are going to create liminal spaces as writers, I think that we have to understand what our space looks like, right? And I think the reality, the cold reality of it, unlike other professions, is we just don't know what our impact is going to be in the world. And I think you have to be okay with that. So anyway, that's where I'm going to leave it for this week. I just had to follow up. It was just a thought that I had, and I was like, I'm driving home from work or from this class, and this would be a great episode of The Writer's Journey to talk about. So if this impacted you, I would certainly love to hear about it. You can certainly drop me a note at michaellaron.com/contact. I always love to hear from anyone who's listening to the show, and what you find interesting, what you would like me to talk more about, what you would not like me to talk about. That's fair game too. But anyway, I hope that you are having a phenomenal November. For all my friends doing National Novel Writing Month who are in the middle of writing your novels, I hope that that is going very well for you. I do have some tips on my Writing Tip of the Day podcast at authorlevelup.com/writing tip of the day. If you need some help with NaNoWriMo, I got you covered. But in the meantime, take care, and I'll talk to you next week. Thanks for joining me this week. If you enjoyed this episode, you'll enjoy my backlist episodes at michaelaran.com/podcast. For your free starter library of my favorite novels, join my fan club by visiting michaelaran.com/fanclub. If you're a writer and want to connect with me further, check out my YouTube channel, Author Level Up, for helpful writing advice at authorlevelup.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week.